Wallace was stuck in a dead-end job, stuck in his thoughts about his failed relationships, and stuck in life in general. A former medical student who dropped out after a devastating breakup, he had decided that love was nothing more than a series of disappointments. He'd spent over a year licking his wounds, convinced he'd never find someone worth taking a chance on again. That is, until one fateful night at a party hosted by his best friend, Alan. The party was typical, crowded, loud, and full of strangers. Wallace wasn't particularly interested in socializing, but then he met Chantry. Chantry was unlike anyone he had ever met. She was witty, sharp, and had an infectious laugh that made Wallace feel alive again for the first time in years. The two hit it off immediately, exchanging sarcastic remarks and obscure pop culture references like old friends. For a brief moment, Wallace felt the spark of something he hadn't felt in ages: hope. But just as Wallace was starting to imagine what it might be like to ask her out, Chantry casually dropped a bombshell. She had a boyfriend. His name was Ben, and they'd been together for years. Wallace felt the air deflate from his chest, but he quickly masked his disappointment. Instead of walking away, he decided to keep talking to her. After all, she had said something that stuck with him. Just because someone has a boyfriend doesn't mean we can't be friends. The beginning of an unlikely friendship. Wallace and Chantry began spending more time together, and their friendship blossomed. They texted, met for lunch, and had long, meandering conversations about everything from favorite movies to existential questions about life. Wallace was careful not to cross any boundaries, always reminding himself that Chantry was in a committed relationship. Still, he couldn't help but feel a growing attraction to her. Chantry, for her part, seemed blissfully unaware of Wallace's deeper feelings. She valued their friendship, especially since her relationship with Ben had recently hit a rough patch. Ben, a lawyer who traveled frequently for work, was often absent. Although she loved him, Chantry couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something was missing. With Wallace, she felt a connection that was easy and natural, and she didn't want to lose it. The fine line between friendship and something more. Wallace, however, struggled to reconcile his feelings. On one hand, he cherished his friendship with Chantry and didn't want to ruin it by confessing his love. On the other hand, every moment he spent with her felt like torture, knowing he could never have her in the way he wanted. His best friend Alan offered blunt advice. If you're in love with her, you have to either tell her or walk away. Otherwise, you're just going to hurt yourself. But walking away was easier said than done. Wallace found himself drawn to Chantry in ways he couldn't explain. They went to museums, cooked together, and even flew a kite in the park one sunny afternoon. Each moment felt perfect, yet it was tinged with the bittersweet reality that Chantry belonged to someone else. Things took an even more complicated turn when Wallace accidentally bumped into Ben one evening. Ben was charming, confident, and clearly devoted to Chantry. Seeing them together only deepened Wallace's inner conflict. He wanted Chantry to be happy, but he couldn't help wondering if he could make her happier. The catalyst. The situation came to a head when Ben received a job offer in Dublin. It was an incredible opportunity, but it meant moving overseas for 6 months. Chantry was supportive but conflicted. She loved Ben and wanted him to succeed, but the idea of being apart for so long scared her. Wallace, meanwhile, couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. If Ben were out of the picture, even temporarily, would it give him a chance to show Chantry how he felt? Before Ben left, he invited Wallace to a farewell dinner. It was an awkward evening, with Wallace struggling to mask his true feelings. Ben, oblivious to the tension, toasted to friendship, and thanked Wallace for being such a good friend to Chantry. The irony wasn't lost on Wallace, who spent the entire dinner forcing a polite smile. After Ben's departure, Wallace and Chantry grew even closer. They started spending more time together, and their friendship deepened in ways that felt both exhilarating and dangerous. One night, after a particularly emotional conversation, Wallace almost told Chantry how he felt. But just as the words were about to leave his mouth, Chantry mentioned how much she missed Ben. Wallace swallowed his feelings and changed the subject, deciding once again that it wasn't the right time. A moment of truth. Everything changed during a weekend trip to the beach. Chantry had invited Wallace along with Alan and his girlfriend Nicole for a getaway. The group spent the day laughing, swimming, and roasting marshmallows by the fire. But that night, as they sat alone under the stars, Wallace's resolve finally broke. "Chantry," he began hesitantly, "I need to tell you something." She turned to him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What is it?" Wallace hesitated, his heart pounding. I I think I'm in love with you." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Chantry stared at him, stunned. "Wallace, I I don't know what to say." Wallace quickly backtracked, apologizing and insisting he didn't want to ruin their friendship. But the damage was done. Chantry couldn't unhear his confession, and it threw her emotions into turmoil. She cared deeply for Wallace, but she was still in a relationship with Ben. Her mind raced with questions she didn't have the answers to. Could she love two people at once? And if so, what did that mean for her future? The aftermath. In the days that followed, things between Wallace and Chantry became strained. Their once easy conversations were now filled with awkward silences and unspoken tension. Chantry tried to sort through her feelings, but found herself more confused than ever. She missed Ben, but she also couldn't stop thinking about Wallace. Meanwhile, Wallace wrestled with regret. He wondered if confessing his love had been a mistake. Had he destroyed the best friendship he'd ever had? He considered Alan's earlier advice and questioned whether walking away might be the best option after all. The breaking point came when Ben unexpectedly returned from Dublin for a surprise visit. Chantry was thrilled to see him, but his arrival forced her to confront the truth she'd been avoiding. Her feelings for Wallace weren't something she could ignore any longer. The choice one evening, after dinner with Ben, Chantry found herself wandering through the city. She ended up at Wallace's apartment, unannounced. When he opened the door, she looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Wallace," she said, her voice trembling, "I don't know what I'm doing." Wallace invited her in, and they talked late into the night. Chantry admitted that she was torn between her love for Ben and the undeniable connection she felt with Wallace. Wallace, for his part, told her he didn't want to pressure her into making a decision, but couldn't pretend his feelings didn't exist. After a long silence, Chantry made a decision. She realized that while she loved Ben, their relationship had become more about comfort and familiarity than true passion. With Wallace, she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. It was terrifying, but also exhilarating. "I choose you," she said quietly, looking into Wallace's eyes. The beginning of something new. Chantry broke things off with Ben the next day, a difficult but necessary conversation. Ben was hurt but respected her honesty. He wished her well and left for Dublin, this time for good. Wallace and Chantry's relationship began slowly, with both of them cautious but hopeful. Their friendship provided a strong foundation. Over time, their love grew even more profound. They faced challenges, of course, but they faced them together, knowing that their connection was worth fighting for. In the end, Wallace realized that love wasn't about avoiding pain or disappointment. It was about taking risks, being vulnerable, and finding someone who made all the struggles worthwhile. For Wallace and Chantry, that someone was each other.